All right. Welcome everybody to the Grit City Think and Drink. I am your host, Jim Gowell. I'm a professor at the University of Washington Tacoma, which normally would be across the street, but at this point it's about a 20-minute bike ride for me to get to campus. I have been hosting this thing this is our 5th year at this point, which is pretty awesome. So looking forward to the 2021 season, and I'm so happy that Chris is going to be kicking this off for us this season. So just to give a shout out, so we are filling in the 2021 calendar as we go. If you have ideas for speakers, please email me. My email is there, jimgowell@uw.edu, and I'd be happy to hear some ideas for speakers that you could think would add to this. We have a speaker for February and March already lined up. So our speaker for February is Charlene Apoc, who is a grad student at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, but also the executive director for Data for Indigenous Justice, as well as some other credentials. And she's going to talk about Indigenous gender constructs, climate change, and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It's an interesting connection. So hopefully you can make it February 9th. This event happens the second Tuesday of every month. So you can put it on your calendar and join us here for whatever we're going to be talking about that particular night. We try to mix it up. So there's talks on just about anything that you can imagine. This is kind of a mix of humanities, social sciences, and sciences all around. So again, if you have ideas, please send them in and we would love to hear them. So I will stop. Oh, I should let you know. So Chris is going to give an amazing talk. And then afterwards, we're going to give away some prizes. So you just have to stick around and probably put in a number in the chat. So to chat things, hopefully you can find the chat button on your either computer screen or phone. For me, it's in the bottom left. It depends on your particular setup, I guess. But if you chat, I will be monitoring that and we'll be using that to guess things for giving away the prizes. Also, that's how you're going to ask questions of the speaker. So as you have questions come up, towards the end of Chris's talk, please chat those in there and I will feed the questions to Chris, and you can play Stump the Speaker with all kinds of questions, which I'm sure will have no relevance within the last week of timing to events that have happened. So just to let you know, that's how you're going to get in contact with me for any questions or things along those lines. I would ask you all I really love seeing everybody's images, but unfortunately, if you're sharing your image during the talk, it takes up a lot of bandwidth on the speaker's computer. So if you wouldn't mind turning off your video during the talk itself, and then you can turn yourself back on later on. And that way we save a little bandwidth and we can actually hear Chris and she doesn't get cut out at some point during the talk. Cool. All right. I will stop sharing that and I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. Chris Demaske is an associate professor of communication in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington Tacoma, where she has served on the faculty since autumn 2001. Her research explores issues of power associated with free speech and free press, resulting in a theoretical and analytical critique of First Amendment applications in areas including hate speech, internet pornography, political dissidence, reporters' rights, and academic freedom. The bulk of her research is focused on exploring the complicated relationship between the First Amendment and culturally disempowered groups in the United States. Her first book, Modern Power and Free Speech, Contemporary Culture and Issues of Equality, suggested a new legal framework for case analysis that would complicate the currently applied content neutrality principle. Her most recent book, which she'll be talking about tonight, Free Speech and Hate Speech in the United States, The Limits of Toleration, uses a social justice framework to address the question, what can be done to curb the I cannot talk because it's a Tuesday night. What can be done to curb the proliferation of hate speech and hate acts in the United States? Without further ado, our speaker, Chris Demaske. Chris, if you want to share your screen, or you're not sharing your screen. So if you want to maximize her view so you can see her, you can do that in the top right of your screen.
Hi, good evening. I don't have any fancy bells and whistles for you, so it's just me. And hopefully I've put together something that is going to be a little bit relevant for today, and I don't get too far in the weeds on all of the academic parts to this. So you know, it's a rather intense time to be giving a talk about anything, let alone about hate speech. You know, in the course of this, you know, less than a week, it's been less really than a week since we had some rather unimaginable occurrences happen. And I've actually spent some time in the past 4 or 5 days scrambling to rethink my presentation for tonight in light of these current events, right? So, you know, the past week, we get our president, who whips the crowd into a frenzy. A mob is going to swarm the Capitol. We end up 5 people die. Since then, and this is probably not news to most of you, of course, but since then, House Democrats have introduced an article of impeachment against President Trump for inciting the mob. Twitter made the decision to permanently ban Trump from its site. Facebook followed suit, banning him at least until his term is over. And Parler, who thought they would be able to pick up the action when Twitter and Facebook removed Trump, they've effectively been removed from the internet as well after Amazon, Google, and Apple all pulled them from their data servers. So these recent incidents, they require a lot of unpacking, and most of that is not going to happen in this talk tonight. However, and I'm going to put my glasses on because I want to be able to see what I'm doing here. For me, in my role as a First Amendment scholar who studies hate speech, these events illustrate the power of speech in society, and they elevate my concerns about the negative consequences of certain types of speech. So for today, I am not going to focus on the specifics of what Trump said at that rally, but I do want to focus on some of the speech issues that are swirling around the president, right? So that's going to come into play here. The speech that he made last Wednesday that led to the mob attack is, to my mind, without a doubt, incitement. And incitement is a category of speech that lacks First Amendment protection. It's not protected speech. My focus tonight is on hate speech, which is a separate category. Hate speech is actually a constitutionally permissible type of speech, so it's okay for you to spew hate speech. And loosely, hate speech has been sort of categorized as speech that expresses hatred or encourages violence against members of certain socially disempowered groups. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about kind of other ways to think about that definition. Concerns about hate speech in the United States predated Trump, absolutely predated him, but the problems associated with hate speech have escalated rapidly in the last 4 to 5 years. And that has been driven in part by his inflammatory rhetoric, but also by the exponential use of social media. So both of those are kind of coming together here. In my recent book, Free Speech and Hate Speech in the United States, The Limits of Toleration, I raised 2 key objectives. The first was I wanted to address the question, and I will talk a little bit more about this tonight, of course, what can be done to curb the proliferation of hate speech and hate acts in the United States. And the second objective in that book was to shift the discourse around free speech protection from promoting individual autonomy, which is what we tend to do right now, and move it instead toward promoting social justice. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the book tonight, but I am going to use those objectives as a meta frame for this discussion. And specifically, I want to do 3 things tonight. That's what I'm setting out to try and do. First, I want to offer a definition of hate speech, or at least give you some explanation of why it is so difficult from a legal perspective to define it. Second, I want to illustrate clearly and forcefully the damages that hate speech can and is causing in our society. And within that conversation, I'll talk a little bit about the debates about whether or not we should restrict hate speech. And then finally, I'm going to end with my response to the situation, which includes a call for legal restriction of some level of hate speech. At the end, my hope for you as a takeaway is that you'll leave tonight with a more nuanced understanding of what hate speech could be as a legal category and why we should consider restricting this type of speech, not despite our commitment to the First Amendment and free speech values, but because of that commitment. So let's start with what hate speech is and isn't in terms of a legal category. And I'm not sure I would have started here if it hadn't been for the events this past week where the media and public discourse has been conflating terms, right? So we seem to interchangeably hear terms like incitement, true threats, and hate speech being used, but these are actually not interchangeable categories. These are legal categories, and they have different distinct elements attached to them. Incitement and true threats, both of those are legally restrictable categories of speech, which just means you can't incite violence and you can't use true threats. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but basically, incitement is speech that is directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action. And if you use that type of speech, it has to be likely that you actually could incite and produce that action. True threats, on the other hand, are statements where a speaker means to communicate a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of unlawful violence on a particular group or a group of individuals. Those categories both have a long history, and some of you may have heard, there were stories today on NPR and in the New York Times, I think in the New York Times as well, talking about this issue of incitement because it's been brought up so much. These categories have a long history through the courts, so they're pretty well defined. But hate speech, on the other hand, is not a legally constructed category, at least not yet. And currently, it is protected under the First Amendment. So I want to talk a little bit about this because this term itself, hate speech, it's messy. It's a highly contested concept. It gets used in a multitude of places. Political theorists use it. Legal theorists use it. We see it sometimes in legal documents at the international level, and we see it in everyday common usage. And the problem is that depending on the context of who's using it and to what ends, the meaning can change. In addition, just another layer of complication with the term is that it often gets conflated or confused with other concepts such as hateful speech or racist speech or harmful speech. These are all kind of slightly different. And the point of this is that defining the concept of hate speech concretely and in a legal sense is fairly difficult to do. But it's absolutely paramount that we do find a way to have that kind of a clear definition because really for three reasons. Without it, we end up talking past each other. Scholars and lawmakers and even the general public can't have a conversation if we don't all understand the terms that we're using. We also have a situation, and this is sort of connected to the first point, that a lack of a clear definition makes it too easy for folks who would like to continue to protect hate speech. It makes it too easy for them to just offhand dismiss the possibility of restricting some of it. And finally, if the end goal, and this is my end goal in my book and in this talk, if the end goal is to produce a constitutionally regulable category of speech, then the parameters of what constitute hate speech must be clearly articulated in order to produce effective laws, right? So this is not surprising that without an actual agreed upon specific definition, we need to be really careful, right? So that we don't end up restricting too much speech. So even within the parameters of legal definition, the concept, there's seemingly endless ways that people have attempted to define this. I'm not gonna, there's an entire chapter in my book about how folks are wrestling with defining this, but I want to offer you kind of the polar ends and then just very quickly the definition that I use. We have, on one hand, we can look at what I would consider to be a rather simple and broad definition, and that is that hate speech is speech that singles out minorities for abuse and harassment, right? So this is a really, to me, probably too broad. A definition offers a little bit more depth, right, that encompasses more and gives us something to work with more, comes from another scholar who says, and this is their language, hate speech refers to an expression that is abusive, insulting, intimidating, harassing, and or incites to violence, hatred, or discrimination. It is directed against people on the basis of their race, ethnic origin, religion, gender, age, physical condition, disability, sexual orientation, political conviction, and so forth. So that definition is attempting to give us a little bit more direction in what we're thinking about in terms of hate speech. It is not the definition actually that I use. I actually build part of my work off of a definition that was developed by a scholar named Baku Parek. When he was creating his definition, he placed it he looked at our longstanding commitment to free speech. Why do we protect speech and what those principles are? And so he wanted to make sure we paid attention to that, but he also was privileging competing principles. And it may sound weird to you to hear that competing principles to our principles that drive free speech are things like human dignity, equality, freedom from harassment, and social harmony. Those are not in line necessarily with protection of speech in the way that we interpret it. So Baku Parek would identify then sort of what he saw as three essential features of what constitutes hate speech. He found that hate speech is speech that is directed against a specified or easily identifiable individual or group of individuals, that it stigmatizes that targeted group by ascribing to it undesirable qualities, and finally, that the hate speech causes the target to be viewed as a legitimate object of hostility by other people. So under this definition, things like direct threats or incitement, which I'm just bringing it back to make sure that we're clear why this is so different from necessarily from what the president did. Things like that aren't actually necessary components. Hate speech doesn't have to have an incitement or threat level necessarily to it. What matters in Parek's definition and what I do as well is really more about taking the content of the speech and connecting it with the long-term effects of that speech. So under his analysis, he argues that speech could be considered regulable hate speech that might include things like shouting racist epithets, statements asking for the removal of an entire population from the country, or say calls to vandalize places associated with an identifiable group. So it's got more teeth to it, but he is making it very clear that there are differences between incitement and hate speech. And we can see that part of that has to do with who's being targeted, and part of it has to do with what that targeting looks like. For me, I think that we cannot develop a workable legal definition until we really address what specific harms are we worried about. And so I want to talk for a bit here, a little bit about the harms of hate speech, because this is a sticking point for First Amendment scholars. Often is they don't necessarily see the harm. they see that there's more harm to restrict that speech. So when we think about harms from hate speech, there's a range. They range from psychological to physical, immediate to long-term, and individual to societal, right? Some of these can include, among other things, physical violence, assaults on dignity, reinforcement of societal prejudice, and stifling of political participation. So let me just pull out a few that I think are really kind of interesting to talk about, and maybe we'll be able to come back to later. All of these harms have been identified by scholars in various fields like sociology, psychology, anthropology, criminal justice studies. So those harms can include physical, and when they talk about physical harm, obviously we can think very clearly about the attacks that happen to people as a result of being targeted by hate groups. But some studies are also showing that there are physical results that happen internally to us. So when we are targeted, people who are targeted, groups that are targeted routinely by hate speech may find themselves suffering from things like heart conditions, high blood pressure, anxiety, stress disorders. There are psychological damages here, and this is actually an area that's had quite a bit of research done, obviously, particularly by psychologists. And those studies are increasingly finding a connection between hate speech and psychological damage, right? So that's a key area. A third area that we can kind of pull out is dehumanization. And this has been studied across disciplines. And what scholars are finding is that there's a dehumanizing effect of hate speech, and that speech not only affects the person or group targeted, but it also leads others to believe that the targeted person is less valuable or not deserving of humane treatment. So not only do we damage the individual who's being targeted, but we damage society as a whole because we put out there this false impression. These studies they've spanned the range from focusing on the impact of hate speech on minority members' place in society, but they've also focused on the silencing effect. And the silencing effect is, to me, a very important one, particularly because I come at this as a free speech scholar. Many scholars, myself included, see this as actually one of the most egregious injuries that result from certain forms of hate speech, right? And the way this works is, if I am dehumanizing you, if I'm using hate speech and targeting you, it may be very hard for you to feel empowered to speak, and that could happen in a one-on-one situation. But for certain groups and over extended periods of time, it also can lead group members to self-censor, right? So the silencing then can take the form of, say, a person not directly responding to you if you target them. It might be that the person doesn't respond to hate speech that's targeting a group that they're a member of. People might start to avoid places where they could conceivably, reasonably anticipate they might be targeted. And probably most concerning is that people will often remove themselves from all social and political conversations. So the question of which exact harms hate speech causes and whether or not those harms are significant enough to justify the restriction of hate speech are perhaps the most contentious points of debate, right? And they're debated across the field. Implied or sometimes stated explicitly by those supporting some level of regulation is a concern for the harms that hate speech can inflict upon individuals, targeted groups, and society as a whole. Those opposed to restricting hate speech, they also address the issue of harm. It's not that they don't see it, but they find it to either be overstated by the regulation proponents, to be undersupported by research, or to not be just not significant enough to curtail free speech. Excuse me. Okay, so you're gonna have to forgive me here. I'm going to oversimplify there's sort of two sides to this debate, because I think it's sort of important to frame this through the free speech proponents and then the hate speech regulation proponents. I would love to get in the weeds on the theory here. I love to discuss law and theory. We're happy to do it later, but I'll spare the general audience from that. Please note, though, I am definitely glossing over many of the finer points, but I think this is going to offer enough of the broad strokes to give a little bit of a layout of the most significant parts. So, current traditional First Amendment theory has its basis in the work done by a scholar named Thomas Emerson, not the poet Nazi Thomas Emerson, but the legal theorist Thomas Emerson. In the 1960s, Emerson would actually be the first person to add sufficient theoretical depth to the discussion of the function of free speech in a democratic society. Kind of prior to that, we just said free speech is good and we should have it. And there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about what does that mean? Why do we know that? Why is it good? He postulated that protecting speech basically served four societal interests. He said that it served to assure individual self-fulfillment, that it was a means of attaining truth, that protecting speech served as a method of securing participation by members in society and in both social and political decision-making ways. And that finally, that protecting speech was a way that we could maintain a balance between stability, so keeping a stable society, and also allowing for changes to occur, right? So those are the four things that he identified, the four sort of values that he identified. Tons of scholarship has come since then, much too much for me to talk about here. But I will say that a lot of those later scholars, while they weighed in and tweaked here and there slightly on where to put the privilege on those values, most of them still come back to the same space, and that is that in not all circumstances, but in most circumstances, it is better to protect speech than to restrict it. So as a result of this reasoning, restrictions on hate speech should be treated to them just as suspect as government attempts to restrict things like political speech, right? So it's all kind of weighed the same. As one scholar had noted recently, and this is their language, American First Amendment scholars have argued that words cannot damage people, that there is not tangible evidence to show that words can truly hurt people, that to suggest that hateful words are equivalent to physical harm is sophistry of the highest order, and that there's no objective evidence of the damage inflicted on the targeted group. Under this reasoning then, if there's no actual harm, then the targets of hateful speech can merely exercise their free speech rights within the marketplace of ideas. Restricting hate speech, according to sort of traditional foundations in free speech in the First Amendment, runs three risks. The first is the slippery slope concern. This is the fear that if we pass one law to restrict this type of speech, it's going to ultimately pave the way for us to restrict more and more, have more and more restrictive laws. The second is a concern that the repercussions could mean that the social, economic, and political majority would actually be able to use those laws, those very restrictions, to silence the dissident or minority group members that they were intended to protect. And then finally, many traditional scholars contend that restricting hate speech will only mask the hatred between groups, not dissipate it. And now I'm going to talk about the other side of the debate briefly. And if you know me, then you know I belong in this camp on the other side of the debate. Starting roughly about the late 1970s, early 1980s, we see legal scholars entering into this conversation and bringing with them a different perspective. They're going to offer critiques of this accepted position, and a lot of those scholars are going to come out of critical race theory and feminist theory early on. These scholars questioned the generally accepted supposition that democracy is best served by protecting virtually all speech. Proponents of hate speech regulation see no value in protecting hateful speech whose only intent is to denigrate and terrorize certain already oppressed groups. They disagreed with the traditional view that hate speech causes no real harm. They disagreed that restricting it would ultimately affect minorities disproportionately negatively. And they disagreed that protecting hate speech, functions as some sort of pressure valve that allows tensions to dissipate so people won't take action. Much of this early critique, interestingly enough, was actually tied to concerns about hate speech on college campuses. In the 80s, as we see admissions opening to larger diverse groups of people, there was a lot of pushback on college campuses, and we saw a move to try and figure out how to make campuses more opening, welcoming space. So much of the early scholarship then started there. It came from a handful of critical race theorists that included folks like Mari Matsuda, Charles Lawrence, and Richard Delgado. More recently, our scholarship focused on the legal response to restricting hate speech is coming largely from the international body of scholarship. Most notably, in 2012, Jeremy Walden's book on hate speech raised considerable discussion among both US and international scholars by offering a meta-critique of free speech absolutism. Right? Waldron would end up developing an argument for some level of speech restriction based on a need for a commitment to protect human dignity. According to Waldron's work, hate speech undermines the very fabric of a well-functioning society by stripping individuals of their dignity and thereby reducing their ability to be productive and successful members of society. Given this position, Waldron would end up positing that we not only can restrict hate speech, but we must restrict some level of hate speech, particularly speech that serves to undermine a person's dignity. So I'm going to kind of bring this together. When we think about the harms of hate speech, we often are really balancing those harms against the protection of speech and what we get from protecting speech. And this plays out in a lot of different arenas, right? I just mentioned the college campus situation. We have tons of case law about cross burnings and rebel flags. I could offer a lot of different examples, but I think I'm going to focus in on one area just to kind of give something concrete here, because we've been kind of up in the theory area. And probably would have talked about this area anyway, which is hate speech on social media. I mean, it seems like a good place to start, given that that's a large part of our issue with the events that are happening in the world over the course of the past couple of years. But I think more importantly, social media is a space where we can see the harms of hate speech illustrated in their most amplified form, right? So it's not that social media created the problem of hate speech, but it's definitely exacerbated it. If we had more time, we could really mine this area of hate speech and social media for all of the problems it's causing, for its role in political disenfranchisement, for the psychological damage it can cause, for the dehumanization that's occurring as a result of it to members of culturally disempowered groups. But we have a tiny amount of time. So I'm going to focus on specifically on the relationship between hate speech on social media and violent crimes in the physical realm. I'm going to offer a few examples. I would apologize if this is triggering for anybody, but I do want to walk through. I think it's important that we recognize the severity of what we're talking about here when we talk about social media and its connection to hate speech on social media and its connection to hate crimes. So in the United States, murders and attacks with online hate speech connection can be traced back nearly a decade. In 2012, white supremacist Wade Michael Page posted in online hate forums before he went on to murder 6 people at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin. In 2015, Dylan Roof self-radicalized online before he murdered 9 people at a Black church in South Carolina. In 2018, Robert Brown had been active on Gab. This was a Twitter-like site used by white supremacists before he killed 11 elderly worshipers at a synagogue in Pennsylvania. In August 2019, Patrick Crusius posted a white nationalist anti-immigrant manifesto on 8chan and then went to a Walmart in El Paso and killed 22 people. Now, those are just some of the most publicized incidents of attacks in the US. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, attacks motivated by bias or prejudice continue to climb. Hate crimes across America rose by 3% in 2019. This is going to take us to the highest number recorded since 2008. And according to the FBI, the report of documented hate crime murders hit 51 last year. That's the most ever recorded since the FBI started collecting this data in 1991. And it is more than double from the number of the previous year. I want to be clear, this is not just a US problem, particularly when we think about hate speech on social media. A couple of examples, what was the worst recent hate-based killing spree? Brenton Tarrant killed 51 people and injured 49 others in 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. Tarrant, who'd been described as a white supremacist and member of the alt-right, live streamed the first attack on Facebook. In October 2019, Stephen Balliet also recorded himself as he went on a killing spree near a synagogue in Halle, Germany. He uploaded his video to Twitch, a live streaming platform owned by Amazon. Twitch removed the material, but not before it was archived on many right-wing sites. So not a comprehensive list, but I hope enough to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about the physical damages that are connected to hate speech. There's a lot of research in this area right now looking at online hate speech and raising the connection, really bringing to light the connection between hate speech and hate crimes. For example, there was a study published in 2018 that looked at racist white supremacist websites over a 10-year period. And they found that there was sufficient evidence to suggest that speech can and does inspire crime. Also in 2018, Karsten Mueller and Carlos Schwartz published a working paper, and it struck quite a bit of attention actually. The authors reviewed anti-refugee rhetoric on a site called Alternative for Germany. It's a Facebook page associated with the far-right party in Germany. Specifically, Mueller and Schwartz reviewed the composition of the users on the page and their location, and they compared that with more than 3,300 anti-refugee incidents in Germany. They would end up concluding that social media has not only become a fertile soil for the spread of hateful ideas, but also has motivated real-life action. And then finally, more recently, several scholars at Cardiff University used computational criminology. So I like to have people who do this kind of work because I don't do any studies that have to do with numbers, but I think they're very important. Computational criminology to study the relationship between online hate speech that targets people based on their race or religion and offline racially motivated religious motivated crimes. And their study that they conducted went on over an 18-month period, and they have found that There's a sort of new understanding here that hate speech through the digital sites, it's a process, not a discrete act. Hate crimes and hate speech are a process, they're not a discrete act. Jim, keep me up on my time. I think I'm about 4 minutes away. Are we okay? All right, thank you. What do we do with all this, right? I've now looked at sort of these traditional perspectives and walked us through some of the issues I think are pressing us to really rethink hate speech, right? In short, this sort of normative view, the traditional way that we think about speech protection has offered us a fait accompli in regard to speech. As one scholar has noted, First Amendment discourse itself has been hegemonic, a dogmatic ideology where there is little free thought about free thought. So in other words, the problem restricting hate speech in the United States really is going to require us to do a couple of things, and I talk about this at length in the book. One is we need a fundamental shift in how we think about the role of speech in society. How does it operate? This shift is going to require us to be willing to question our past conceptions about why, when, and how speech is protected and to what ends. All right, so if the overall reason that we protect speech is to promote and foster a free democratic society, then the protection that's legislated needs to be considered in relation to actual outcomes. So in the case of hate speech, we need to think about the fact that that type of speech actually impedes the ability of people to participate in that way. The second piece is once we can kind of shift towards this new way of thinking about the power of speech in modern society, then the courts are going to need to craft a legal tool that's going to simultaneously offer some additional protection for those members of the targeted groups, but also still protect the highest amount of speech possible, right? And again, that test is something that I work on in my book, where I apply using part of the definition of hate speech that I talked about earlier from Perec. And I also build into that test some additional things we should think about, or the court could think about in assessing hate speech regulation, and that would be thinking about things like context of the speech, social power relationships, and history. I'm going to bring up my final concern, which I'm not sure I would have necessarily hammered home too hard, except that it seems important right now. And this has to do with the power we are now seeing our social media companies exercise in regard to our free speech. You know, I'm gonna be honest. I did a little bit of a cheer when I heard that Twitter had decided to permanently ban Trump. I did. Had a little happy dance. And yet, I think we need to be mindful of the long-term consequences of allowing these corporate owners to function as the de facto sovereigns of cyberspace. In terms of First Amendment law, these companies are private companies. First Amendment law has no say in what they do or don't restrict, right? So at this stage, places like Facebook and Google don't have to follow the same rules that the government has to follow in terms of whether or not they protect or restrict speech. So when we think about these corporations, we need to recognize that we're giving them quite a bit of power to determine what we see. And so, you know, about a couple of years ago, Mark Zuckerberg was talking to the Senate at some point and said that he knew that within 10 years, they'd have an algorithm they could use that would pick up hate speech on their sites and they could just pull it off. And this doesn't get us past the issue of who got to decide what the hate speech was, right? Are we leaving it up to Zuckerberg and the rest of them to determine what we should be exposed to? And I'll add an additional thing on the social media sites, and that's just a reminder that they're owned by highly profitable corporations, right? Facebook brought in $16.6 billion in ad revenue in the second quarter of 2019. right? Mark Zuckerberg himself has a net worth of about $55 billion. Because corporations are money-making entities, their decision-making process is more likely to be driven by profit than by public good, right? So they're going to be more likely to make their decisions about content based on their bottom line, as opposed to the citizen's right to engage in open debate, whatever we think that looks like. So I'm going to kind of, end here by just saying we've had a history in the United States of supporting this axiom about free speech that says the answer to speech we don't like is to just speak back. Traditionally, our First Amendment scholars, our jurists on the courts, our Supreme Court justices have echoed this position, and they've called for an almost absolutist protection of speech. Those scholars and jurists have and continue to exercise what scholar Steve Schifrin recently called free speech idolatry. However, the current treatment of hate speech in the United States is problematic for a myriad of reasons that we are, I think, beginning to see escalate now. Old arguments that free speech serves as a societal pressure valve and that open speech leads to truth hold little sway when here we are about 200 years later, and hatred against groups based on their identities is still rampant and insidious. A hard line on the protection of hate speech becomes even more problematic when we place it within the social media network, and it forces us really to address this question in a significantly different way. And I'm done.
Thank you very much. It's a virtual applause. Chris can just imagine the number of people applauding at this point. So before we get to questions, and I appreciate we already have some questions in the chat box, I want to take a break from the really important topic that Chris has been talking about and give away some free socks, because there is nothing that makes us a little bit more happy in the start of 2021 than to have the coolest Grit City Think and Drink socks on the block, so that every time you look at your feet, you can smile, or to whoever you give these to. So we have medium/large and small. I think those are basically, they're like somewhat unisex, but really men's sizes. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and you get to chat your answer. In the first person to get closest to these answers will win those socks. But for me to get them to you, since you are not here in person, you will actually have to chat me your mailing address, and I will send you the socks. Be aware that only Chris and I have access to the chat, so this is not going to Mark Zuckerberg for any use beyond sending you some socks. So I hope that allays any fears. So first question is, what percentage of the US voting population voted in the 2020 general election? What percentage voted in the 2020 general election in the US as a whole? I see 70, 72, 68, 61, 32, 65. Holy crap, there's way too many people in this thing. Oh, I saw a 66. Who was that person with a 66? Before I lose it. Somebody chat who had 66 up there to start with. Oh, now people are going with percentages, decimal points. Sorry, I will figure out who the first 66 is, and I will chat to that person real quick. But the first person that had the 66 in the chat, you get to get the first pair of socks. That is 66 point something percent. Sorry, close enough. Second question for the second pair of socks. Also, whoever won those, I need to know your size, so let me know. Second question is, what was the percentage in Washington State? What was the percentage of voters voting in Washington State? 70, 68, oh, 84, Leanne, Lux Bashand has it right there, but she already has a pair of socks, so we're gonna give it away to another person. Heather Hux also had 84, so Heather Hux gets a pair of socks unless she already has a pair of socks. So we'll let you guys duke it out. But thank you very much. Way to go. That was quick. So make sure you chat me your addresses so I can get those to you. And we will take some questions for our speaker, Chris Demaske. Chris, I had one question earlier before all the numbers filled up the chat box. And that was from Hanan. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. What lesson do you think college administration can take from this talk? And how should they respond when students invite folks who spread hate speech?
Oh, I have so many thoughts on this.
So the rest of the day goes to that first question.
Yeah, well, it could. I won't let it happen. You know, I'm not shamelessly plugging the book, but I will say that I do have a section, actually, a chapter in the book that talks about this very issue of external invited speakers to campus, right? Because this is a problem. I'm thinking about how to respond to this. University administrators tend to be placed in a really awkward position. And we actually saw it at UW a couple of years ago with Milo Yiannopoulos and some issues that would occur in Seattle. And it really does put administrators in this interesting space of either they allow a speaker like that to come to campus, in which case they are, you know, promoting hate, or they say no to the speaker, in which case they are squashing free speech, right? So it's not. I want to start off by saying I don't envy people who are in the position to have to make that decision. Having said that, I think that campuses could and should take a stronger stand. They certainly could make an argument that they could use their campus codes for student conduct. They could use their commitments to diversity, equity. Like, there's a lot of language they could use to allow them to restrict some of that access. Don't get me wrong, the minute they did, they will be in court. There is no doubt about it. Most of those hate speakers who are coming to campuses, it's a win-win for them. Either they get to come and spew hatred at you, or they get denied and then they get to sue you, and they get to become sort of a martyr for their cause. So it's a complicated area, but I actually feel like, you know, and again, in the privileged world I live in, where I don't have to worry about costing the university millions of dollars, I think it would be worth it to try to make the argument that there's no place on the campus for that type of speech.
Awesome, thank you very much. And I agree.
Oh, by the way, before you go on, it would be a lot easier for schools and universities to be able to restrict this kind of speech on their campus if we could have some sort of legal construct that says hate speech is not okay.
Nice. Question from Adriana. What changes in hate speech restrictions have occurred or become precedent in recent years, say last 2 decades?
So the idea of hate speech restrictions, which of course started in the 80s, and trying to again think about how far in the weeds to go, but what happened? We're here. We get this push in the 80s to start restricting speech on campuses, and some of you may have been like me in college in the 80s. I was on a college campus in the 80s, and I can distinctly remember all of the discussions about you know, the push for political correctness, and but this really was a move to try and create this welcoming environment. Most of those particular types of ordinances that were happening on campuses got struck down at the lower court levels, right? So they never made it to the Supreme Court. The first case we'll see really get to the Supreme Court, which would be in '92, was a case called R.E.V. versus St. Paul that had to do with an ordinance that restricted people's ability to say hateful things targeted towards certain particular groups. The court in that case found that that ordinance was unconstitutional. because it required us to make a content or viewpoint distinction about which speech is good or bad. And I bring up that case, and I won't go into a whole lot more depth on it unless people really want to talk about RAV versus St. Paul, but I bring it up because it's a linchpin of pretty much all of our all of our legal cases that are going to come later, where we have an attempt to try and restrict hate speech. And that is that the courts have very clearly said we can't restrict speech based on viewpoint. And yet, by its very definition, hate speech is restricting speech based on viewpoint. That's the point of it. And so we still have folks trying later. Some ordinances have gotten around some of this. So for example, we have what they call speech plus laws or enhancement statutes. So if you commit a crime and in the process of committing that crime, you also use hate speech, it turns it into a hate crime and it adds years onto your sentence. So beating somebody up is one crime, but yelling racial epithets at them while you're beating them up can add extra years. I think in Washington State, it might be 5 extra years on your sentence. Don't quote me on that. Each state has a slightly different variation, but they're enhancement statutes. And that made its way to the Supreme Court as well. And they said that was okay, because that was sort of more similar to speech being used to prove an element of a crime as opposed to the speech itself being criminal. And some states, and this would make its way to the Supreme Court as well and would be found to be okay, have found that cross burnings, right? And believe it or not, I don't know if you're surprised, but these are still happening everywhere. And up until the mid 2000s, places felt like cross burnings were kind of okay because of the case in RAV versus St. Paul, right? So you could get in trouble for burning something on somebody's yard, but you couldn't get in trouble for being a cross, right? That factor wasn't in there. The state of Virginia passed a law that said that if you were burning a cross with the intent to intimidate, then that would be that'd be additional violation. And it did make its way to the Supreme Court, and the court actually said that it's okay to restrict cross burnings with an intent to intimidate. But there are two kind of caveats to that. One is it's intimidating anybody, right? So we can't single out and say that this is targeting particular groups worse than other groups, right? Just this idea that cross burnings would make anybody jumpy and nervous. The second piece was you couldn't assume that just because someone burned a cross that it was done to intimidate, right? So a Klansman who burns across their property and they all dance around in their robes, according to, at the time it was Sandra Day O'Connor with the opinion, she said, well, that's kind of a form of ideological solidarity, so not a threat. And I bring this up because you can see there's some clever ways to try and get around, to offer a solution to the end result, but even Virginia versus Black, even that Virginia statute, it misses the point, right? Because it's not actually addressing hate speech. It's addressing an act that the courts have been able to say anybody could be intimidated by. So where we are right now is kind of in this sort of weird space of a lot of scholars are talking about this. You see a lot of discussion on campuses about how do we deal with the problem of hate speech. You have a lot of cities and municipalities trying to figure out how to deal with this escalation. And yet, we're not going to see too much being pushed through the courts because nobody expects this Supreme Court to be the one that resolves the hate speech problem, right? And we also see, of course, that there's been, with the president that we had in office, there was quite a bit of pushback, even for us just to talk about, equality on campus and diversity and equity, right? He wanted us not even talk about it, let alone protect it. So right now, I'd say we're not really seeing a lot of new laws, although we are seeing, interestingly enough, a lot of chatter among people who traditionally would have been against restricting hate speech are now starting to see the possibility that we might need to restrict some of it. And you see some of that. The New York Times has been covering quite a bit of that lately. So that's kind of interesting.
Mindful of the time, and I know that there are just so many questions that people have, but we're going to take one more question so that we can all go and have dinner or whatever it is that you're going to do next, wherever you live. I would point out, again, the next talk is February 9th, so we hope you'll join us then. And for any of the other talks this year, I put in the chat the link to the website that will have Chris's talk recording there when we get it up in a few days, a week or so. And then all the previous talks are up there if you want to check them out, or if you want to pass this along to anybody who missed it. So our last question is from Sid and Reverend Sarah Prickett. They ask, do you think that as racial minorities become the majority, it will become harder or easier to enact the kind of restrictions you discussed?
Well, thanks for the questions. I don't know that I have a hard and fast answer to that. But I will say that just increasing numbers, I'm not sure is actually going to change anything. It's the system that's flawed, and so in that end, more numbers won't necessarily be the response. So that's one way to look at it. But on the other side, I do think that as we get more folks who can come to the table and bring a different perspective, this is where we'll see the shift, right? This will be the way that we see the shift. I mean, I'd like to end on a hopeful note. I mean, clearly I wrote a whole book on this. And so I don't want to be pessimistic. I think that that change is possible. And I do think that the more people we have in the room willing to engage in this conversation, the more likely we're going to see some change. And often more people in the room means a more diverse group of people in the room.
All right, thank you very much. Let's give a big round of applause virtually to our speaker, Chris Demaske, for an amazing talk. Thank you very much. This was great. And I don't think we imagined just how relevant this might be when you agreed to give the talk in January, but I appreciate it. Thanks so much, and good luck with the book. We will, just in case there's additional questions that for folks that that have been asked, I'll share the chat with you, Chris, and that way if you know the folks, you can get back in touch with people. You can also contact me at jimgell@uw.edu if you have additional questions, and I can pass them on to Chris if you have anything else or if you don't already know how to get in touch with her.
Thanks everybody for coming, and there's so many people here. That's so cool. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oops. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and hopefully we'll see you in February. And may 2021 get better and better. Take care, everybody.